My cousin Ethan and I grew up together, but I never liked him very much. His family was rich, so he always had the best stuff. Mine wasn't, and I didn't. On Halloween of 1985, we were going trick-or-treating together. I was the Terminator. He was Freddy Krueger. His mask cost almost $100, and it looked exactly like Freddy's face. The scars, the sneers, everything was just right. I didn't have a mask. My parents couldn't afford one. I had torn aluminum foil taped to the side of my face. It was meant to look like the Terminator after some skin had been ripped off. A few splotches of ketchup on the foil were supposed to look like blood. As soon as it dried, it looked very little like dried blood, and very much like dried ketchup. Despite my terrible costume, I was still excited to trick or treat. We didn't have candy very often at home, except maybe on Easter. My parents encouraged me to go to as many houses as I wanted to get all the candy I would be able to eat. It felt good to know they wanted me to be happy. Ethan and I went out at sundown and visited house after house. Every time the homeowners would gush over Ethan's mask. They would tell him how scary it was, how realistic. Then they would turn to me and ask me who I was supposed to be. I would answer, and then they would say something like, "Oh, of course. How could I have missed it?" I could tell they felt sorry for me. One even handed me a few extra pieces of candy. When we were done, our pillowcases were stuffed with treats of every sort. We began the long walk back home. As we went, Ethan rooted around his bag of loot. I could hear him grumbling and complaining through his mask. Then he started throwing candy on the street, stuff he didn't like.
Go ahead and pick it up if you want it, Bill. I know you can't afford to let anything go to waste.
He called out, heaving handful after handful into the gutter. I didn't say anything, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out a lighter and 2 cigarettes I had stolen from my dad. I had been smoking on and off for the last few months. Even at 13, I knew it was bad for me. I just didn't care. It made me feel good. I stayed a few steps behind Ethan as he tossed more candy away. As much as I hated myself for it, I ended up picking up a few pieces off the ground and putting them in my bag. Ethan caught me once and laughed.
You're gonna be as fat as your mum if you eat all that.
I kept my mouth shut.
Is that why she got fired from the restaurant? Did she eat a customer's food?
I knew Ethan was joking, as he did often. I'm sure in his mind he thought he was being harmless and playful. Still, I told him more than a few times to leave my mom out of the jokes. She had diabetes, and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone other than my dad and me, but the doctor told her that she might end up losing her foot. That's why the restaurant had to let her go. She couldn't walk around and wait tables anymore. "Change the subject, Ethan," I said. I knew he heard me, and he didn't talk for another minute or so, until he did again.
Hey, you think her and your dad still fuck? I wonder how he even manages to get it in there.
He cackled, then insisted.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm done. Promise.
I seethed as we took a shortcut through the elementary school soccer field.
Let's stop here for a minute,
Ethan said. We had gotten to the school's playground.
I bet I could scare the shit out of some kids if they come by.
He sat on one of the swings, with his pillowcase on his lap. He kicked his legs, and the swing moved back and forth. I stood there, hating him. "I think I see some kids coming over the hill," I told Ethan. "I'm going to hide behind the slide and sneak up on them if they come over to you."
Go for it,
Ethan told me, his voice deep and distorted through the mask. I left Ethan on the swing set and walked over to the slide. I watched him on the swing as his hateful words rang in my ears. Tears came to my eyes as I remembered my mom smiling from her spot on the couch as she encouraged me to go out and have fun. She was such a good person. She never said anything negative about Ethan. In fact, she always complimented him on his grades and his wins in basketball and even his looks. "You're going to be a handsome man someday, Ethan," she told him. "I bet we'll see your face in a magazine someday." Even after her kindness, Ethan still felt it was okay to trash her. I heard him laughing to himself across the playground. I didn't know why exactly. but I thought I had a pretty good idea. I reached in my jacket pocket for another cigarette, knowing a smoke would calm me down. But it had come apart. My pocket was full of loose tobacco and paper, and the lighter. Ethan was still laughing as I fingered the lighter in my pocket for a second. Then I pulled it out. I walked up behind him. Ethan didn't know I was there as he shouted,
Okay, one more thing, and I'll never say anything about her again. But unless your dad's got a big dick, he'll never manage to.
I flicked the lighter near the back of Ethan's neck, right where his hair and the mask met. The hair went up quickly, using his hairspray as an accelerant. Then something happened I didn't expect. The mask burst into flames. Ethan jumped off the swing and ran in a loose circle, trying to pull the mask off his head. I saw it ripping under his fingers. He couldn't get a grip. The material bubbled. His screams barely muffled as the molten chemicals clung to his skin, echoing off the brick walls of the elementary school. After a few seconds, he fell and rolled around on the playground, pushing his head into the sand to try to put out the fire. He succeeded, but the damage was done. He turned over on his back, no longer screaming, but gasping and shallow hyperventilated breaths. In the moonlight, I saw the mask was completely fused to what remained of his skin. One of his eyes had completely burst, but his other darted around, almost like he was confused and wondering where he was. I saw something moving on the other side of the field. Kids were coming. I yelled to them to call an ambulance, and I waited, unsure of how I felt, until the paramedics got there. I took complete responsibility for setting Ethan on fire. I said I had been sneaking up to scare him by flicking the lighter near his face. And yes, I got into a lot of trouble, but everyone believed it was an accident. Ethan's face was destroyed. He had skin grafts and bone grafts and all sorts of reconstructive surgery, but he never recovered, not physically or emotionally. He killed himself in 1990. His parents held a very expensive funeral. I was invited. They had forgiven me for my part in his accident years before. In fact, their subsequent lawsuit against the mask company is the reason why Halloween masks are now made with flame-retardant materials. My mom died a few years before Ethan, but not before complications from her diabetes took her left leg. Dad and I were with her in the hospital at the same time Ethan's parents were there to see him through another round of reconstructive surgery. They visited Mom, Dad, and I while Ethan was still recovering after a successful set of grafts. We chatted for a while about Mom's hopes for recovery, and then the topic moved to Ethan. Ethan's mom was gushing about how a plastic surgeon had recently joined the hospital after working in Switzerland. He was the best, apparently. He had taken on Ethan's case earlier in the year, albeit remotely. He wrote a substantial article about the new techniques he would be employing. In the world of plastic surgery, it made a big splash, if only for its ambition. Ethan's mom reached into her purse and pulled out the publication. She flipped it open to the page that showed various photographs of Ethan's burns, along with notes and explanations the doctor had written to accompany the article. I could tell Mom was holding back tears. I knew why, too. Her eyes met mine, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She began to weep. Dad and Ethan's mother held her while she cried. I just watched. Mom was thinking that she had been right all those years ago. She had been right for all the wrong reasons, but right nonetheless. Just like she had predicted, Ethan's face had finally made it into a magazine.
It was a boring summer night. I just finished my school year and had a lot of time on my hands. My days were spent skateboarding with my friends at the park. Skating was my passion at the time, and virtually all of my free time was spent doing it. But some evenings, however, I found myself bored and at home. I was never much of a gamer, so watching my favorite series was my favorite pastime. But let's face it, even your favorite activities get boring after several days of doing them. But one night in particular, I was thinking back on a conversation with a friend. My friend used to go on the website Omegle and try and prank people. He often would pretend like he was a girl by putting on very well-made makeup by his sister. Due to his young face, he looked like an actual girl. This rather effective catfishing got some really funny reactions. Boys on the other side of the screen would sometimes get aroused and compliment him. After toying with them a little, he would reveal his real gender by showing his manly, deep voice. These stories my friend told were hilarious, so much so that I decided to try out Omegle myself. At first, I was genuinely bent on meeting people online and seeing where it would take me. I was also expecting to hopefully meet some cute girls from my area. I know it seems cliche and over-romanticized, but I was a lonely man during this time. I'd never been in a legitimate relationship before. I wanted to fall in love with someone. I wanted to care about someone. Sadly, Omegle disappointed me rather quickly. Every time I tried to make any conversation with someone, they would skip me. Sometimes I couldn't even say a word. I came to the conclusion that maybe they were only looking for girls on this page. After all, every other dude had their pants down and were showing their privates to the camera. I was shocked and disgusted at first, but after 10 times of seeing something, you tend to get used to it. But at this point, it was 11 p.m. I decided to skip the last few people and just call it a day. But when I was about to do this, I encountered something I really didn't expect to see on my screen. The first thing I noticed was a large table with guns spread across it. Behind it, a weird-looking man. My heart rate started rising. I counted around 6 guns on the table. What was happening? Why would someone just show their guns like this on Omegle? They had to be fake, right? While I asked myself this, I focused my attention to the man. His room behind him was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything but him and the guns. The man was sitting still behind his table, eyes wide open. He had long black hair, and his whole outfit was dark too. He was in some sort of goth-type outfit. Even the skin around his eyes were painted black, almost like some sort of clown or Joker, but with grayscale. His lack of movement was starting to play on my anxiety, but somehow I waited for him to start the conversation. After a long and awkward minute of staring at each other, he finally started to type something on his keyboard under his table. Curiosity would be an understatement to what I felt right now. I was really intrigued for some reason. What could this guy possibly be typing? The text read, "Hello, I choose you to choose my destiny. We will be playing the notorious game called Russian Roulette, but this version's a little tweaked. On my table here, I have 6 guns. 2 of them are fully loaded, and the rest are empty. You will decide which gun's trigger I should pull aiming to my head. We will do this twice, and if I survive, I win. If not, you win." I laughed out loud reading this message. I'm no expert, but the guns were clearly fake. He was trying really hard to make me believe in this prank. Thinking back to one of my friend's stories on Omegle, he also mentioned people doing stuff like this. So at this point, I immediately knew this was an act. And from my angle, the guns didn't seem glossy enough at all to look like actual metal. They seemed like they were made of plastic for some reason. Knowing all this, I proceeded. I was bored and I wanted to see how far this guy would take it. Would he actually fake his own death? So, I looked through the guns and decided to pick the one on the left. I messaged him this and he picked that gun. I was more excited and intrigued than freaked out. I was curious to see how far this guy would take his performance, if you will. He then showed the gun to the camera and clearly showed all the details a real gun would have. I could finally see the glossiness of the gun's metal and was really impressed with the realism of the gun. It must have been some sort of movie-level prop. Despite all this, I never in my wildest dreams considered the possibility that these would be real guns. He then stuck the gun to his head and closed his eyes, slowly pulling on the trigger. The gun just made a click. At this point, I was 100% sure that these were either really good fakes or they were all empty real ones. I was eager to pick the next gun, desperate to show the man that I didn't fall for his stupid prank. We then repeated the process. He asked me to pick one gun, and I picked the one in the middle this time. He then started to shake like a leaf. He put the gun up to his head, but this time, it was a lot different. He was still quivering, and he seemed like he wanted to try and put the gun down for a second. He was hesitating to pull the trigger. It took him around 2 minutes to finally gather the courage. I didn't even blink or flinch at this time. I was just amazed at the man's acting. His shakes and quivers looked almost genuine. But then, it happened. He pulled the trigger, and I could see his head blowing off with a lot of blood spraying around the room. A few drops sprayed on the camera. This thankfully blurred the horrible sight of whatever remained of his lower head. But even through the blood, I could see his muscles start to twitch and spasm. After a few more seconds, they stopped moving. I immediately looked away from my computer and closed my eyes. I kept telling myself that there was no way this could be real, but I was starting to believe that he wasn't pretending. The blood looked too real, and there was no way this man could have faked blowing his head off. This looked more realistic than AAA movies. This couldn't have been an edit. It had to be real. I kept closing my eyes and opening them a few times to see if his body was still there. My anxiety attack was at its peak. Part of me was just waiting for the man to start moving again, hoping it was some sort of 3D animation. The other was facing reality. But his body never moved. I decided to stay on the page as long as I can to see if the body will at least shift a little. Maybe someone from his house will enter the room and quickly rush him to a hospital. I was devastated, but at this point, I started to feel sick to my stomach. I rushed to the bathroom and started throwing up. I passed a good 20 minutes before I came back into my room, slowly opening my laptop. I really hoped it was only just hallucinations or something, maybe a dream. I just wanted to wake up from this nightmare, but then it hit me. I just witnessed someone taking their own life. When I looked back at the screen with horror, the image was still the same. He couldn't be pretending this long. Now I knew for sure that this couldn't be a prank. I came across the idea that I could yell into my microphone or maybe alarm someone at his apartment or house. Try and unmute myself and see if that'd do anything. Maybe someone was around and could help him. But unfortunately, in my panic, I clicked on the wrong button. This instantly closed the chat window with the man. I tried to reopen Omegle, but at this point, Omegle already assigned me a new stranger. I decided to try and just somehow sleep, hopefully erasing it from my memory. I obviously couldn't do this. I couldn't help the man anyways. I didn't know his name or location. After about a week, I buried the memory deep in the back of my mind. I never told my parents. I never told anyone for that matter. I was just too ashamed, too afraid, too embarrassed. I still occasionally think about the incident after 4 years. Maybe if I just believed him, maybe if I just listened to him, I could have somehow talked him out of it. But I can't change the past. I need to try and forget about this. There's nothing I can do.
This can be identified and stopped before more people like Steve are lost. People who try so hard to tread water, only to end up slipping beneath the waves. My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at, therefore it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired, and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure if it was still standing. So, after half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it. That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers, and the massive porch was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit and, what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes someone would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishings, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason for our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate quilt easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in a room next to me. I joined her and we discovered another much older photo album and decided to bring back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up silently on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out, quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared to belong to my mom. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed my mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said and she feared she couldn't take it back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place that she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of the house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, "Goodbye, Mom." A couple of weeks later, after everyone had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how the poor condition of it hurt my mother, I proposed we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to at least try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was given their blessings and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the one who truly made it all possible.
This happened late one night, when I was driving back home from work. on a dark and lonely highway. It was the kind of night that makes you wish that you were at home relaxing instead of being out on the road. There were no other cars in sight, and by happenstance, I was driving through dark territory, meaning that there was no reception on my phone. I'd been driving for quite some time and was starting to zone out a little bit. That's not to say that I was falling asleep behind the wheel. I was just sort of on autopilot. As I rounded a bend, I saw a semi-truck parked on the side of the road ahead of me. Not really anything out of the ordinary. Truckers will sometimes park off to the side to catch some shut-eye during their long trips across the country. But there was something about this truck that unnerved me. I got the feeling that whoever was behind the wheel wasn't resting. They were waiting. I slowed down as I approached the truck, and I tried to get a good look inside of the cab. But the windows were tinted, and it was very dark out, so it was like looking into a black void. I also noticed that both the truck and the trailer were completely black. After passing the truck, I sped up and returned to my original speed. I didn't want to go too fast in case a trooper was hiding out somewhere, tagging passing cars. As I continued down the road, I kept thinking back to that strange truck I saw. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was in some kind of danger. Perhaps it was just my overactive imagination. Damn it, get a hold of yourself. It was just a trucker counting sheep on the side of the road. Saying it out loud did not make it any more convincing. There was something off about that truck. As I was about to turn down another corner, I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving up behind me. I looked in my rearview mirror as a pair of headlights came up fast behind me. I panicked and pressed down on my gas pedal, but my car was nowhere near fast enough to outrun the truck. The headlights were now directly behind me, practically blinding me. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I knew that there was something up with that truck, but now I had to do everything I could to get away from it. But the road was narrow, with no side streets or exits in sight. I was trapped out here, with this massive 18-wheeler right behind me. Suddenly, a hidden trooper didn't sound too bad. As we continued down the road, the truck eventually slowed down and stayed a safe distance behind me, still not making any attempts to pass me. The truck then flicked off its headlights. Oh, hell no. I immediately sped up, looking into my rearview mirror. I could make out the vague silhouette of the truck getting further and further away as I floored it down the highway until it disappeared from view. When I finally arrived home safely, I parked my car in the driveway and went inside, making sure that all my doors and windows were locked. I was exhausted. Nothing takes it out of you like being afraid for your life out on a dark highway. I just wanted to get some sleep and put this entire thing behind me. About an hour later, I was woken up by the unmistakable sound of an idling engine coming from outside. Half asleep, I got up and looked out my window. I became fully awake once I saw what was parked outside. A black semi-truck parked in the road outside of my house. Not only was I terrified from my previous encounter, but what was equally jarring was that this massive truck was in a residential area. I have no idea how that driver maneuvered down the narrow streets. This was the first time I got a good look at the truck. It had no commercial markings on it whatsoever, so there was no chance of me calling a number to let the company know that one of their drivers is a psychopath with a bad case of road rage. Also, I never got a good look at the driver's tags, but I imagine they would have read, "Beating you." I mentally could not handle seeing the truck outside of my house. I just remember saying, "No," and crawling back into bed. I didn't have the energy to deal with this insane shit. I just remembered hearing the truck pulling away as I drifted off to sleep. To this day, I'm still not sure if the driver somehow found out where I lived, or if it was just a very vivid nightmare. The next morning, I considered calling the police to report the strange encounter, but honestly, what were they going to do? There was no damage to my car, and there was no proof of what happened out there on the highway. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I became severely paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and freaking out every time I saw a dark-colored truck. One day, I was walking back from the grocery store, and I saw a black semi parked on the side of the road. After nearly having a panic attack, I was put at ease once I saw the commercial markings on the side of its trailer. I realized that it was just another semi-truck with a black paint job. What happened to me that night was terrifying, but the fear that it caused me was taking over my ability to be rational. After a while, I could not allow it to control me anymore, and I eventually had to move on with my life. It's been years, but I still think about that black semi-truck from time to time. Ultimately, this experience has taught me to trust my instincts and to be extremely cautious when driving alone on remote roads. I still wonder who was behind the wheel of that truck and what their intentions were.
I'm a female who used to work at Chick-fil-A when I was in my late teens and early 20s. Overall, it was a fun place to work and I made lots of friends. Everyone who worked there was super nice, which is why I stayed working there for so long. However, at one point, we hired a new guy named Justin. From the day he started working there, Justin just seemed like a jerk. He was rude and selfish and would do things like go on his phone during shifts, take really long bathroom breaks, and leave early. I found out he was a relative to one of our managers, and as a favor to his family, she was able to get him a job. He was a somewhat troubled guy who had gotten into some problems before, but it was thought that the job would help him out. For the first few weeks, though, it didn't. For the most part, when I first met him, though, he was rather nice to me. Shortly after that, he asked me out during a shift, though. He basically asked what I was doing and if I wanted to hang out or go someplace with him. I really didn't want to and told him that I was busy. Over the next few times that we worked together, he remained persistent and would ask me to hang out after work or something like that almost every time. When I would say no or come up with excuses, he would seem to grow increasingly angry. I also heard from another female worker that he had been doing the same to her. He was a bigger guy, almost looked like a football player as he was over 6 feet tall with very short hair and strong looking. One night, he asked me to hang out after work because he saw me clocking out for my lunch break. I told him no again, but this time he grabbed my arm. He asked me why in a very serious and frustrated tone. I told him I was sorry, but I just really didn't want to. The way he aggressively grabbed me made me kind of worried, and I decided in that moment I would have to talk to my boss because I had really had enough of him. The rest of my shift was really busy, and as it was time for dinner, we had a big rush. I didn't get a chance to speak with my boss, Christine, and I even forgot about the situation. Finally, after things quieted down and we were no longer busy, my shift was over and it was time for me to go home. I clocked out and then got my coat and headed for my car. As I approached my car, I suddenly saw somebody jump out from behind it. Where I was parked, it was at the back side of the restaurant that was bordering a grassy area with a couple of trees. I saw the person who had jumped out was Justin. I was really surprised to see him. He said to me that I had no reason to dislike him and asked me what my problem was. I told him I really didn't have a problem with him, I just wanted to go home. He was standing blocking my driver's door, and I knew it would be hard for me to get around him. I asked him if he should get back to work. He then told me that he was off and he had been off for 2 hours just waiting for me. Obviously, this creeped me out even more. He then stepped towards me and grabbed my arm again. When he did, he shoved me in the opposite direction. There was a car parked 2 spaces away, and I guess it was his because I heard it unlock. He then shoved me to the car and told me to get inside. I asked him why. He said he just wanted to talk. When he said this, his voice seemed to lighten up. I figured maybe I could have an actual conversation with him and let him know he needed to leave me alone and these things are not okay. I reluctantly got inside the car. Justin shut the door and then walked around and got inside to the driver's seat. But instead of talking to me, he immediately started up the car and began backing out. He also locked all of the doors in the process. Right away, I got a terrible feeling. I asked him what he was doing. He said to shut up and then cursed at me. He then went on a short rant about how he hated working and how he had just quit. As he did this, the car started to speed up and he merged onto a busier road. I knew I was in trouble and took out my phone from my pocket and immediately went to dial 911. Justin saw me doing this, and I was just barely able to hit call on my phone. I could hear the ringing on the other end, but no more than a couple of seconds of this, and Justin reached over and grabbed my phone. He yelled at me and we wrestled over the phone for a couple of seconds. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull it away from him fast enough. He got control of my phone and then rolled down his window and tossed the phone out onto the side of the road. He then kept on driving. I was terrified. I knew that I could no longer call for help and decided that I had to try to think of something to do. Justin just kept on driving down the road at a really fast speed. None of us said a word for several minutes. I was just doing my best to think about what I could possibly do to try to escape. Then, suddenly I saw the amazing sight of flashing lights behind us. Justin started yelling and cursing, and eventually he pulled over. The police pulled over with him, and as soon as the car stopped, Justin opened his door and took off into the woods. I saw the police officer run after him, and I got out of the car. The officer told me to stay put, and then he called for backup. Eventually, more officers arrived, and a short time later, I heard that they had caught Justin after a foot chase. The police told me they had received a 911 call from my phone, and even though I didn't talk to anyone, they decided to investigate the area the call was made from. They only originally pulled over Justin because he was speeding, but after he took off running, they went after him. I was so grateful that I was all right and got out of that situation. After that, I took some time off of work and eventually returned to work there for a short time more.
Tickets for my favorite group were going on sale. Getting tickets for them is hell, and having a good laptop and Wi-Fi was key to up your chances on snatching a good seat. My university's Wi-Fi was complete ass, so I decided I would go around to various fast food places and test their Wi-Fi to see which one was the best. This wasn't too hard to do, since my university was walking distance from an abundance of various restaurants and fast food places, plus more food places that were a few minutes away by car or bus. One of the places I decided to test was McDonald's, which was only a 5-minute drive away from my university. I had my boyfriend take me, and we went inside and set up my laptop, iPad, and iPhone. We ordered something to snack on as well, because you can't pass up the opportunity of McDonald's fries if you are in McDonald's. In front of our table was a group of old guys who looked around the age where death would be knocking on their door soon. Me and my boyfriend were busy checking the Wi-Fi speed and conversing and giggling when one of the old guys stood up and decided to jokingly make a comment along the lines about how we should be doing our homework on a weekend and how teenagers were always working or on their phones. I don't exactly remember the wording he used, but it was along those lines. We both just awkwardly chuckled, and then we went back to what we were doing and tried to look busy. Apparently, old people don't care if you are busy or whatever, because he kept making jokes and speaking to us and telling us to stop working, etc. Notably, the majority of his remarks and conversation were directed towards just me and not to my boyfriend. Now, I was already kind of nervous because people randomly talking to me makes me a little antsy, especially ones who keep rambling after I make it clear I don't want to talk anymore. But him being an older man added to my nervousness even more due to how creepy and predatory they can sometimes be. He started asking questions that were more personal, like where did I go to school, how old I was, and whatnot. I was getting uncomfortable at this point, but answered his questions and told him the college I attended and how old I was. Looking back now, I don't think me telling him the truth about it was that harmful. He probably forgot them as soon as I told him. He also started complimenting me, then saying how pretty I was. All the while he was doing this, the other old men were either laughing or telling him to leave the poor girl alone. He started to make comments on me and my boyfriend's relationship as well, saying how cute we looked. It was nice to see young couples and how long we'd been with each other, etc. After we answered, he laughed and said, "Well, if you ever get tired of him and want to look for someone else, I'm always available. You can kill me and get some money." I was 100% uncomfortable at this point and just laughed along nervously while scooching closer to my boyfriend. I don't think he was serious though, and was just trying to joke around with us to seem likable or cool, but him even suggesting that was creepy and uncalled for. He finally left us alone after all the chuckles to himself and went back to talking amongst the old men. After a few minutes, I asked my boyfriend if he could grab us some things from the car because I wasn't feeling too good due to reasons. As soon as he left, the old guy and his friends got up too, and I hoped they would just walk out and pass by my table without saying a word. But apparently I have bad luck, so instead some of the old men talking to me stopped right and stood by me. He saw my university ID card and picked it up, making remarks of how good I looked in the picture and how I looked even prettier in person, and just kept looking me up and down. His friends chuckled and told him to leave the poor girl alone again, and I hope he would clean the wax out of his ears and listen to leave me alone. He just laughed and placed his hand on my shoulder, giving it a light squeeze while exclaiming, "No, I won't leave her alone. She's too cute." At this point, I was way past uncomfortable. I knew nothing deadly was going to happen to me because we were in a public place, even if the McDonald's was empty, so I knew they weren't going to kidnap me or anything, but I was still severely creeped out. I was screaming in my head for my boyfriend to hurry the fuck back in here so they would leave, because I didn't know what to do besides nervously laugh. They lingered for a little while the old guy looked at my ID card one more time before putting it back on the table and squeezing my shoulder again. He finally left after telling me to have a good day. A few seconds later, my boyfriend returned, and I was sitting there trying to relax and calm my nerves. I might be overreacting at getting so nervous, because the threat of me being taken or hurt was most likely next to none. But old men hitting on young girls just severely creeped me out beyond words.
Context: I am currently a senior in college and live off campus with my two best friends. This time of year, particularly around Thanksgiving, my friends try to help me stay busy as it is typically a difficult time for me. My mother left our family the week of Thanksgiving when I was 8 years old, and my dad passed away 5 years ago on November 22nd. So as I said, it's a pretty easy time of year to get myself down in the dumps if I don't stay active. Every year for the last 3 or 4 years, I have gone to one of my friends' houses to celebrate Thanksgiving with their families. But this past year I decided I wanted to just stay home and have a mellow long weekend. I figured I could catch up on work as well as my schoolwork, which was pretty far behind. My roommates and I didn't live particularly close to the university. We lived in a suburb about 15 to 20 minutes outside of the school. This was nice because we didn't ever have to host any parties. We could just attend them near campus and head back home afterwards. Anyways, there was one house on our street that didn't quite match the others. It wasn't that the house was worse than the others, but it had no landscaping and desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. My roommates and I knew the owner as he introduced himself when we moved in a few years back. His name is Jacob. He's about 5'6" and probably weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. Every time we've had an interaction with him, he was always very nice and polite. He even helped us fix our porch light when it broke last summer. He seems to be very cordial with everyone in the neighborhood and has helped numerous people with small handy jobs similar to the one I just mentioned. On the Wednesday night leading up to Thanksgiving, my two roommates went back to their families' houses in their hometowns. They both asked several times if I was 100% sure I wanted to spend Thanksgiving alone and that I'd be fine by myself. I honestly thought I would be, and thought perhaps enough time had passed that I could just focus on other things and not dwell on the past. I stocked up on Mountain Dew so I could stay awake after my assignments to play some PlayStation. At about 9 or 10 p.m., I went up to my room to throw on some sweatpants and grab the blanket for my bed. I glanced out my window and saw Jacob sitting on his front porch with the 2 porch lights on. I didn't think anything of it and went downstairs into the kitchen and made a peanut butter and fluff sandwich. I would say I was in the kitchen for probably about 5 minutes or so, finishing eating and doing a few dishes. When I finally sat down to play some games, I thought I heard something hit the front bay window, so I went to take a look. At first, I didn't see anything, but then noticed that Jacob had now turned the porch lights off and was standing on his front lawn, staring at the house with his head tilted like he was looking towards the windows upstairs. A little creeped out, I tried calling one of my friends who knew I was still in town to see if she wanted to meet up or stop over to hang out for a little bit. She didn't answer, so I sat on the couch for a couple of moments trying to figure out what to do. He was still standing there staring and seemingly moving a few feet closer to our property each time I looked. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't call the cops. He hadn't done anything except freak me out a little, and to this point, he hadn't even stepped on my property. After another few minutes, I looked out the window again and saw Jacob now on our lawn looking at the corner of the house. At least that's what it looked like he was staring at. At this point, I wasn't sure what his intentions were, and I didn't want to find out. Perhaps I was blowing this out of proportion, but I was legitimately scared. I grabbed my keys and phone and a few other items, thinking I would just drive to campus. Maybe the library was still open, even though we were off for the holiday. I kept all the lights on so I didn't seem like I was leaving and decided I was going to sneak out the back door. As I quietly sneaked through the yard, I turned the corner to quickly get to my car, and there was Jacob, standing in our driveway. I asked him what he was doing in the driveway, and he put his finger over his mouth to make a shh noise. I slapped him as hard as I could and made a run for it past my car. My instincts and adrenaline told me to just run until I found someone or someplace else. As I got about a block or two down the road, I saw a bunch of cop cars pull up towards the area of my house. Confused, I began to go back towards my house, thinking perhaps another neighbor saw Jacob stalking outside of my house and called the police. As I approached the house, one of the officers asked my name and if this was my residence. I confirmed the information, and what I heard next is still the most horrifying and disturbing information I had ever received. The officer stated that Jacob reported that he was on his porch when he saw me from across the street. He saw me walk out of my upstairs bedroom, and as I walked away out of the room, he saw a man come out of my closet. Apparently that was why Jacob was looking into my room when I saw him the first time, and also why he was looking at the corner of the house. He was following the intruder who was now walking into my roommate's room. When I last saw him outside my house before I slapped him and ran in terror, Jacob stated that the random guy in my house had made it to the downstairs. Jacob was trying not to make any noise as not to alert the person inside, fearful he could be violent or dangerous. As soon as he saw the man in the house, Jacob called the authorities and did his best to try and defuse the situation and not bring any alarm to myself or the intruder. The person inside the house was arrested and taken away. He didn't have anything on him other than a knife, so it is unclear if he was attempting to rob the home or was planning something more sinister. Either way, I couldn't express to Jacob how much gratitude I had for what he did. He even tried apologizing for how he handled the situation, stating that there were probably things he could have done differently to make sure I was safe and aware of the situation. Unfortunately, this experience adds another mental scar to this time of year that will take a long time to get over. But one thing I can be sure of is that I will never spend a Thanksgiving holiday alone again. I grew up in a place called Hemel Hempstead here in the UK. It's a fairly small but old town just over 20 miles outside of London. Nothing much happens there. It's honestly a pretty boring place. But it currently wasn't boring in December of 2005. In fact, something happened down there that I don't think anyone who was around for it will ever forget. So picture the scene. It's almost Christmas for 17-year-old me. Decorations are going up all over town. Christmas songs are starting to be getting played on the radio, and with every day that passes, the town center is getting busier and busier with everyone doing all their Christmas shopping. Saturday evening of the 10th of December was one pretty much like any other. I played a lot of football in the park with my mates in the afternoon, then got home just after dark to tuck into the Indian takeaway that my dad brought home pretty much every Saturday, a fond little tradition we had going at the time. Mom and Dad stayed up quite late, just watching telly and working their way through a bottle of wine while I stayed up in my room playing PC games until about 2 a.m. the next morning. I was absolutely exhausted by the time it came to climb into bed, and I drifted off fairly quickly, having planned on sleeping until late Sunday morning. But just a few hours later, I found myself jolted awake by something horrifically loud. I rolled over in a fright, and because it was still dark at the time of the morning, it took me a minute to work out that there was broken glass all over my bed and all over my carpet. The windows in my bedroom being completely and utterly smashed in, and there was this deep rumbling sound grumbling all over the neighborhood outside. I had no idea what was going on, but I remember my first thought being that our house was being violently burgled or something, so I threw my trainers on to not cut my feet on any of the broken glass before getting up to run into my mom and dad's room. And that's when I caught a glimpse of the open windows. In the distance, this huge, bright orange fireball was rising up into the sky. I mean, it was absolutely massive, and looked almost identical to the kind you see after a nuclear explosion. I was absolutely horrified, like I legitimately thought someone had dropped a bomb on the UK, and 1,000 terrified thoughts rushed through my head all at once, picturing the nuclear apocalypse that would inevitably follow. The entire world was about to be thrown into a horrific atomic dark age, and I believed that I was witnessing the first moments of it. Right then, my dad came running into my room to check if I was okay, and when he saw that fireball and uttered a shell-shocked, "Oh my God," he had a fear in his eyes that I'd never seen before or since. We both watched for a moment as fires engulfed a huge spot on the horizon, and big patches of the starry night sky were being totally blocked out by smoke. Then we saw and heard more explosions, flashes of orange on the horizon, and these weren't nearly as big as the first one. So at the time, I was obsessed with this game called Fallout 2. It was a bit of a cult hit at the time. Not all that many people have heard of it, unlike now when all the other games have meant that pretty much every gamer on every platform is familiar with the Fallout universe and all its entails. I absolutely love Fallout 2. I still do, because it completely captured my imagination and filled me with a morbid fascination with all things atomic warfare related. It sounds a bit daft in retrospect, and maybe it was just how tired and frightened I was, but I really did think it was the end. But Dad was quick to reassure me, in a pretty grim way to be honest. "It can't be a nuclear bomb," he said, still sounding pretty shaken. "I mean, if it was, we'd all be dead, son, quick as a flash. Besides, there's an oil storage place out those ways, isn't there? It's gotta be that." And he was dead right, because the morning of the 11th of December 2005 was the day the Hertfordshire oil storage terminal blew up and what became known as the Buncefield explosion. From what I read later, the first explosion, the one that blew our windows out, happened just after 6 a.m., and firefighters were on the scene less than 10 minutes later. It was all because of a fuel leak apparently, quite a slow one that caused a vapor cloud that was eventually ignited by something, causing a gigantic boom that was apparently the biggest explosion in Europe since the end of World War II. I know the bang had smashed out windows for miles and all that, which actually still boggles my mind to this day, but you really didn't get a sense of the destruction until the sun had risen a little bit, and you saw the cloud of smoke rising from the oil terminal. It was gargantuan, and I know I can't get it across in words, if you get a chance, Google it and you'll see what I mean. It blocked out half the bloody sky, like I've only seen things that big in freaking Godzilla movies and stuff. It was so massive it was like your brain just couldn't even compute the size of it. I really haven't seen anything as big before or since. About 2 hours after the explosion, we got a knock on the front door from the police, telling us and our neighbors that we had to evacuate our houses for safety reasons. Not only was there broken glass everywhere, but apparently local authorities were extremely concerned that the wind might change and that the huge smoke cloud would engulf the area, which, as you can imagine, would have been really bad news for us. We ended up staying in a hotel for a few days, and as a weird kind of silver lining, we got a few days off of school since a lot of similar damage was done to the buildings there, and they had to get structural engineers in to give the place a look over before they announced it was safe. I'm not traumatized by what happened that morning, but all in all, the Bunsfield explosion was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and one that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering with the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I've become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kinda zoned this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realize the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, when I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable.
This story happened about a year ago. I was at Chick-fil-A with my girlfriend one night. It was one of both of our favorite restaurants, and we would get it all the time. Usually we would go through the drive-thru, but tonight we decided to eat inside the restaurant. It was a little bit later at night, and not very many other people were there at all. We sat in a booth on the far side of the restaurant, and were all by ourselves for the most part. We were eating, joking around, and just having normal conversation, when all of a sudden I heard a banging at the window right in front of me. We were sitting by the window, so I was super startled. Because it was dark out and the way the window was, I couldn't really see out of it very well at first, but when I looked, I saw a man. There was a guy who looked pretty mean. He was angrily banging on the glass right in front of us. My girlfriend and I were both pretty startled, and we watched the man to see what his problem was. He started to yell something at us, but I couldn't understand what he was yelling. The man wore a dark sweatshirt with the hood up and appeared to wear glasses and have a brown goatee. I don't know if he was insane or what, because I certainly hadn't done anything to make him angry. The man then suddenly stopped yelling and turned his back on us, then sprinted away into the night. My girlfriend and I both looked at each other in shock. "What was that?" she asked. I figured the guy was insane or on drugs or something like that, but we were both just glad that he was gone. Like many Chick-fil-A's, it was next to multiple businesses, so we figured he had come from one of those. We both talked about it for a few minutes, and then were ready to go back home. I had to use the bathroom, so I told my girlfriend that I would be right back and then we would leave. I walked inside the bathroom and to the urinal and did my business. As I was in there, though, I remember seeing someone was using one of the stalls in the men's room. When I was done, I got to the sink and began washing my hands, when I heard the stall door start to open. I casually looked over to see who was coming out. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the same man who had been outside. He stopped in his place and just stared at me. Then, slowly, a really wide and creepy grin came over his face. I didn't waste any time and quickly left the bathroom as fast as I could. I saw my girlfriend was waiting for me by the door, and she could see the panic on my face. She asked me what was wrong, and I just told her we had to go. I didn't pay any attention to if the man followed us or not. When we got to the car, I told my girlfriend about how I had seen the man in the bathroom. She was really shocked to hear this, and we drove home after that. Thankfully, we never saw the man again. What was the most crazy thing is that we had a view of the only entrance to the restaurant the entire time, and we never saw the man come inside the door. I don't know how he was suddenly inside the bathroom, but thinking about it gives me the creeps.
I was 23 years old when this happened, and was living in the city of brotherly love at the time, Philadelphia. The girl I was dating lived about 35 to 40 minutes outside of the city, near West Chester. After hanging out for a while, I left her place around 12:30 a.m. I really shouldn't have stayed out that late because I had an early shift that morning. As soon as I left her neighborhood, I noticed that my gas light was on. I put in directions to the nearest gas station on my GPS and drove 5 minutes to the local Wawa. I was familiar with this area. It was very low on crime, unlike many other places outside of Philly. So stopping here this late at night wasn't something that I was nervous about. There were 2 other cars parked there when I pulled in. I filled my tank, and I realized that 2 of my tires were low on air, so I drove to the corner of the parking lot where they had the air pumps. I started working on my first tire, when I looked up and saw an older pickup truck pulling into the parking lot. I didn't think twice about it, until it drove up right next to my car. The truck began backing into the area where another air pump was. Any other day, I would have just assumed that it was somebody else trying to get air into their tires. But something gave me a bad feeling. The driver exited the truck. He looked to be in his late 50s, early 60s, and had scruffy facial hair and glasses. He looked like the stereotypical creep. He just stood by his driver's side door and stared at me. This was when I began to feel uneasy. Is your pump out of order, sir? I asked, trying to break the tension. The man did not respond. He just kept giving me that cold stare. He finally moved away from the door and reached into the bed of his truck, his eyes never leaving me. He then produced a rope and began sprinting toward me. I immediately threw down the air nozzle and jumped into my car, which was already running. I threw it into drive, when suddenly, a hand slammed directly on my driver's side window and dragged sideways as I peeled out of there, leaving a smear. As I was driving home, my heart was pounding out of my chest for the first 10 minutes. I've never had anything like this happen to me. 2 weeks later, a girl I was friends with on Instagram posted an article about multiple kidnappings in the Westchester area. I immediately thought back to that man in the truck. I'm thankful that I was able to escape. I almost became a statistic.
My name is John and I'm 35 years old. I'm a security guard and have been for a while now. About a year ago, I got a job working night shifts at a small hotel. My job will be sitting at a desk watching a computer monitor, which was connected to a few cameras located around the hotel. And every hour or so, I would get up and patrol the area. This one night, I was sitting at my desk scrolling through my phone when I took a quick glance at the monitor and saw there was someone in the laundromat, which was located in the basement. There shouldn't be anyone down there at the time. I remember thinking that, which was past 2 a.m. I should mention that the camera quality wasn't the best, but it was good enough to see when something is going on. So I went down to the basement, turned my flashlight on, and spoke out. Is anyone down there? You need to leave right now. I tried to sound confident when I said that, but I'm not sure if it came out that way. Going down into a dark laundromat basement in the middle of the night is pretty creepy, especially when you saw someone in there. And what's more creepy was, no one replied. And there was no one down there. I went back upstairs to my desk. As I mentioned earlier, the camera quality wasn't the greatest, so I brushed it off to being a glitch in the footage or something. I continued looking at my phone, but this time more cautious to the monitor. It wasn't long before I noticed something on the screen again. It was in a laundromat. I looked closely and I swear I was certain I saw something. I could see someone pacing back and forth. Once again, I went down to the basement and into the laundromat to check, shining my light and asking who was down there. There was no reply. I couldn't see anyone in there. The laundromat wasn't that big, so I could clearly see if someone was in there. And it was empty. I was so confused and at the same time frightened. How can I see someone on the camera, but the room was clearly empty? Just as I was heading back upstairs, I heard a bang. Then a continuous banging. I shone my flashlight into the laundromat and I saw one of the washing machine doors was swinging open and shut by itself, slamming into the machine each time. I slowly walked up to the swinging door and put my hand in front of it, and it stopped. As soon as I stopped the door from swinging, I heard a whisper in my ear, and something grabbed my shoulder. I jumped and turned around, seeing nothing but an empty laundromat. I ran upstairs and out of the basement, back to my desk. I looked at the monitors again, and this time, there was nothing on the screen, except you could see that the washing machine door opened and closed by itself. I rewound the footage back to see if I could see something that I may have missed. The only thing that I could see, though, was me walk up to the washing machine door, stopping it, and me getting frightened and running out of the laundromat. I could make out one word from the whispering I heard in my ear, and that was leave. The next night I struggled to get through the night shift. I kept watching the monitors expecting something to happen, especially in that laundromat, but I never did. I was too scared to work there after that, and the following day I told my boss that I was leaving. I'm not a superstitious man at all, but I honestly believe that what I experienced was 100% supernatural.
Ever since I first went to Chick-fil-A, it's been one of my favorite restaurants. I've always loved their chicken sandwiches, and their sauce always hits the spot. However, the college that I recently graduated from is in an area where there's no Chick-fil-A nearby, so when I was at school, I could never have it. Last year, when the semester finally came to an end, I was driving back home to get to my parents' house, and I had the idea to get Chick-fil-A. I left my school in the morning, and it was a 4-hour drive to get back home. When I got about an hour away from home, my cravings got the better of me, and I saw a Chick-fil-A and stopped. It was a Chick-fil-A that I had never been to before, but it looked relatively new and was very busy. I got in the drive-thru line, which was long but moving fast. I ordered the number 1, which is what I usually got, of a chicken sandwich, fries, and a drink. I was so hungry that I decided to park and eat it there. The Chick-fil-A was in a large shopping area that had a mall with a really big parking lot connected to it, so I drove to an open area of the mall parking lot that wasn't very busy. I started to eat, but before long I was kind of annoyed with the way that the sun was shining right into my front window onto me. I moved parking spaces down to where there was a shady spot near a tree. As I backed up my car out of the spot and started to drive, I saw that there was another car that was parked a little ways away from me that started to leave at the same time. I drove over and parked next to a tree, and the car followed me and parked about 10 spots away from me. I found it odd, but overall was more focused on eating. A while later, when I decided to continue with my drive home, I had forgotten all about the car and started to drive away. But when I did, I noticed the car start to drive with me. I never bothered to look to see who was driving it, and it was too far away to tell by this point. I once again found it odd, but what could I do? I got back on the road and then merged onto the freeway that was close by. I noticed the entire time that the car that was seemingly following me did the same. I got kind of worried when I saw this. I wondered why someone would follow me. Had I accidentally cut him off or something before? I kept on driving down the road and the car remained behind me the entire time. I tried some things like slowing down or changing lanes, but he kept following me. I still couldn't really tell much about how the driver looked because I still wasn't able to get a very good look at him. The closer I got to home, the more concerned I became because I didn't want to go all the way home and have this guy potentially know where I live. When I got about 10 minutes away from home, I decided to pull off the highway again and take the exit. I didn't really have much of a plan, but I knew I shouldn't go to my house with somebody following me. There was a little town that had a few stores and gas stations. I pulled into the parking lot of a supermarket and parked in a spot in the back where there weren't many other cars. Of course, the car that was following me did as well. I got out my phone and called my parents. I was going to tell them that I had been followed and ask them what to do, but before I could finish telling them, I saw that the car had parked in a spot behind me and a few spaces to the left. I noticed that the driver's door of the car opened, and both passengers' doors in the back did as well. I saw 3 large men all get out of the car and start heading towards me. In this moment, as they approached my car, I panicked and slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away. I saw the men then stop and begin to run back to their car. This is where I got lucky in a way. There happened to be a police car that was driving on the quiet road connecting the supermarket with other businesses. When he saw me speeding away in an almost reckless way, he pulled me over. The car that was following me slowed down too, but then drove away. When the officer got to my window, he told me I was driving a little wild, and I told him my situation. He then gave me just a warning to slow down and drive safer, and offered to drive behind me for a few miles to make sure that I wasn't followed. I took him up on the offer, and luckily I was able to make it home safely without ever seeing that car again. I still wonder sometimes though why that car was following me for so long, and what the men wanted.